All right, I'm very excited for this panel. Little something different. We've, I guess, collectively decided on a number of poems to read. Each poet here will read a poem, or possibly two, from Brooks's work. Not exactly spanning the length of her career, but from throughout her career, and then offer us a few thoughts, either before or after that reading, on that poem. It's a pretty amazing lineup, and I'm just going to try to stay out of the way. I'm going to introduce everybody all at once and tell you what poem each person will read. Aishion Hutchinson will start us off. He's the author of two poetry collections, House of Lord and Commons and Far District. He was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica, and he moved to the United States in 2006 for graduate studies. He's the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award, the Penn Joyce Osterweil Award, a Lannan Writing Residency, and the Larry Levis Prize from the Academy of American Poets. Ilya Kaminsky describes him as, without a doubt, one of the most gifted poets of my generation. He lives in Ithaca, New York, where he teaches in the graduate writing program at Cornell University. And he's going to read the appendix to the Aeneid, sorry, not the Aeneid. Okay, next, Gregory Pardlow will read The Lovers of the Poor. And that's, of course, from Bean Eaters. We're very heavy on Bean Eaters, which is interesting, right, given that Lawrence Jackson called it a volume yesterday in which Brooks finds a kind of new intensity. Pardlow is the author of the collection Digest, which won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Digest was also shortlisted for the 2015 NAACP Image Award and was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. His other honors include fellowships from the NEA and the New York Foundation for the Arts. His first collection, Totem, was selected by Brenda Hillman for the APR Honigman Prize in 2007. He is also the author of Air Traffic, a memoir and essays forthcoming from Knopf. Pardlow joined the faculty of the MFA program in creative writing at Rutgers University Camden this past fall. Next, we have Ed Roberson, who will read A Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi. Meanwhile, a Mississippi mother burns bacon, which is a poem also from the Bean Eaters, 1960. Roberson is the author of 10 books of poetry, including the chapbook Closer Pronunciation, and the collection To See the Earth Before the End of the World. An earlier collection, Atmosphere Conditions, was selected for the National Poetry Series and nominated for the Lenore Marshall Award from the Academy of American Poets. He's the recipient of the 2016 Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize from the Poetry Foundation and the 2008 Shelley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. Roberson lives in Chicago, where he has taught classes and workshops at the University of Chicago, Columbia College, and Northwestern University. He has served as an instructor for the Cave Canem Retreat for Black Writers and as the Holloway Visiting Professor at UC Berkeley. He is Distinguished Lecturer Emeritus at Northwestern University. Finally, Nate Marshall will take us forward by reading The Blackstone Rangers from In the Mecca, 1968, and then The Near Johannesburg Boy, from, I think, 1991. Anybody want to correct me on that? 87, thank you. And I'm glad that poem was brought up in the last panel. Nate Marshall is from the south side of Chicago. He's the author of Wild Hundreds and an editor of the Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop. Wild Hundreds has been honored with the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's Award for Poetry Book of the Year and nominated for an NAACP Image Award. His last rap album, Grown, came out in 2015 with his group Daily Lyrical Product. Nate is a member of the Dark Noise Collective. He has received fellowships from Cave Canem, the Poetry Foundation, and the University of Michigan. He is the National Program Director of Louder Than a Bomb, the Louder Than a Bomb Youth Poetry Festival, and he's a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University. So it's an incredible lineup. I'm very excited to have you all here. Aishion, we'll start with you.
Greetings. Is it still morning? Good morning. Two quick corrections. Of course, I'm not going to be talking about the Aeneid, and I am not going to also be talking about the appendix to the Aeneid. Let's see what I'll be talking about. The minuets of reciprocity. It is always at the podium that one feels suddenly inadequate and experiences what is popularly called a language crisis. And you have to forgive my brief and incoherent remark on this remarkable poem, the Aeneid, which I am going to try to eavesdrop on its unique brand of heroic gesture and style. The poem, as you may recall, is in the mock heroic genre, which means it at once employs and subverts the conventions of the epic, an approach not untypical of the lyric's natural transgressive nature. The epic, crudely put, is the narrative of a nation, or in Pound's more informal formulation, a poem including history. That whole scale of chronology Brooks's own poem compresses into the single character, body, mind, and soul of her heroine, Annie, in 43 septets or 7-line stanzas. The time compression of the poem is its first great achievement. Linearity is abolished for the trans-shifting intersection of what the last line calls the minuets of memory. A minuet is, of course, a slow, stately ballroom dance for two in triple time. To dance a minuet is a common 18th century phrase. This indicates the bitter courtly romance which occupies most of the poem. But more importantly, for my concise consideration here, a minuet is a triple time movement in a suite or sonata, and it is exactly at the level of this triple metronome music that Annie's subjectivity is revealed, hence why the poem is named after her and amplifies outwards from and through her. I would contend that her subjectivity or self-concentration of looking in her looking glass mirrors, in fact, the minuet fictive structure of music, and the courtly dance, even when her paladin, her lover, is present, is always solo. The poem hinges painfully on absence, which Annie's imagination at every instance is called upon to reinforce with concrete emblems of herself. At times, the declension of absence in the poem converts eros, love, to horrors, violence, but more often both together into minuets of subtraction. Think of sweet and chocolate, minus passing magistrate, minus passing lofty light, minus passing stars for night, Sirocco wafts and tralala, minus symbol, cinema mirages, all things suave and bright. What is acute here and undeniable is the trochaic tetrameter equity of sound, which creates a balance between slow and fast, a balance measured by the way in which the anticipatory music of the rhymes preserves the sensory quality of words. Added to that and multiplied all over the poem, the anaphora of minus divides the word min from us, to evoke on the quotidian plane the separation and terrible reunion of Annie and her paladin, but metaphysically suggests also the severance of Annie from Annie into someone almost thoroughly derelict and dim and done. Almost. I want to look at that word shortly and ground it in the kind of heroic gesture Brooks attains in her poem by way of repeating a repetition of the poem. I enjoyed being technically passionate, Brooks said. I think the Aeneid is just an exercise. Her comment reminds me never to trust poets on their own poems. Even so, the phrase technically passionate admits the arduous surrender it takes for techne, that is, the bringing forth of the true into the beautiful, in order to reach, in Brooks's case, a radical poetics of the inward self. J. Wright observes somewhere that the black poet's astringent encounter with form have had to take place side by side with his or her struggle for self-apprehension, self-perception, incorporation into and reconciliation with a world larger than the self, larger even than most of our definitions of the world. We are immersed in Annie as she is in herself, and we cannot escape her. Neither can she escape herself, precisely because of the reciprocating minuet of Brooks's lyric mastery. Thanks.
Thanks, Aisha. I'm going to read The Lovers of the Poor, as I've read it a few weeks ago at the Art Institute, and I had taught this poem before, but reading it in Chicago at the Art Institute was an entirely different experience. I was conscious of audience in a way that I hadn't been before, and the bitingness of the poem became really apparent to me in surprising new ways. I'm also thinking about this idea of convergence that has been going on this morning, and the way I think about this poem, for better or worse, is it is a moment where she is on the perhaps pinnacle of double consciousness, about to slough off the double consciousness that may have marred earlier poems, in the context of the time, that is, earlier poems of the Black poetry community. She's largely a narrative poet, and where in the poem does the turn occur, right? So we have these women coming to the tenement, and they're moving through the tenement, and at what point does it turn? And it seems to me it depends on what perspective we take, what narrative perspective we take, will determine where the turn, or influence our choice of our understanding of where the turn occurs. So if we're thinking about it from the perspective of the women coming to the tenement house, the turn might occur. I don't know. Let me think about it, and ask you to think about it while I go through the poem. But if we think about it from the perspective of the people who would identify with the residents, I think it would occur in another place. One last thing. I always enjoy the stumble of moving into the poem, because she doesn't give us a chance to prepare, right? So the Lovers of the Poor, the first line is arrive. You're like, well, when did the poem already started, right? And so it's a classical move. However, I think it's an interesting device. The Lovers of the Poor arrive. The ladies from the Ladies' Betterment League arrive in the afternoon, the late light slanting undiluted gold bars across the boulevard, brag of proud, seamed faces with mercy and murder hinting here, there, interrupting, all deep and debonair, the pink paint on the innocence of fear. Walk in a gingerly manner up the hall, cutting with knives served by their softest care, served by their love so barbarously fair, whose mothers taught, you better not be cruel, you'd better not throw stones upon the wrens. Herein they kiss and coddle and assault anew and dearly in the innocence with which they baffle nature, who are full, sleek, tender-clad, 50-ish, aglow, all sweetly abortive, hinting at fat fruit, judge it high time that 50-ish fingers felt beneath the lovelier plains of enterprise, to resurrect, to moisten with milky chill, to be a random hitching post or plush, to be for wet eyes, random and handy hem. Their God is giving money to the poor. Their guild is giving money to the poor. Right, and so after this dense lyric passage, we have the clearing. Their guild is giving money to the poor. The worthy poor, the very, very worthy poor. Very, very worthy and beautiful poor. Perhaps just not too swarthy. Perhaps just not too dirty, nor too dim, nor passionate. In truth, what they could wish is something less than derelict or dull. Not staunch enough to stab, though, gaze for gaze. God shield them sharply from the beggar bold, the noxious needy ones whose battles bald nonetheless for being voiceless hits one down. But it's all so bad and entirely too much for them. The stench, the urine, cabbage, and dead beans, dead porridge of assorted dusty grains, the old smoke, heavy diapers, and they're told something called chitterlings. The darkness, drawn darkness or dirty light, the soil that stirs, the soil that looks the soil of centuries. And for that matter, the general oldness, old wood, old marble, old tile, old, not home kind oldness, not like Lake Forest, Glencoe. This is what I'm talking about, right? Has an entirely different resonance depending on place, which is interesting in light of Larry's talk. Nothing is sturdy, nothing is majestic. There is no quiet drama, no rubbed glaze, no unkillable infirmity of such a tasteful turn as lately they have left Glencoe, Lake Forest, and to which their cars must presently restore them when they're done with dullards and distortions of this fistic patience of the poor and put upon. They've never seen such a make-do-ness as newspaper rugs before. In this flat, their hostess is gathering up the oozed, the rich rugs of the morning, tattered the bespattered, readies to spread clean rugs for afternoon. Here's a scene for you. The ladies look in horror behind a substantial citizenness whose trains clank out across her swollen heart, who, arms akimbo, almost fills a door, all tumbling children, quilts dragged to the floor and tortured thereover, potato peelings, soft-eyed kitten, hunched up, haggard to be hurt. Their league is allotting largesse to the lost. But to put their clean, their pretty money, to put their money collected from delicate rose fingers, tipped with their 100 flawless rose nails, seems, she doesn't tell us. They own Spode, Lowestoft, candelabra, mantles, and hostess gowns, and sunburst clocks, turtle soup Chippendale, red satin hangings, Aubusans, and Hattie Carnegie. They winter in Palm Beach, cross the water in June, attend, when suitable, the nice art institute. Buy the right books and the best bindings. Saunter on Michigan Easter mornings in sun or wind. Oh, squalor. This sick 4-story hulk, this fiber with fissures everywhere. Why, what are bringings of loath, love, largesse? What shall peril hunger so old? What shall flatter the desolate? Tin can, blocked fire escape, and chitterling and swaggering, seeking youth in the puzzled wreckage of the middle passage, and urine and stale shames, and, again, the porridges of the underslung, and children. Heavens! That was a rat, surely off there in the shadows. Long and long-tailed, gray. The ladies from the Ladies' Betterment League agree it will be better to achieve the outer air that writes and steadies, to hie to a, so is this where it turns? Is this the turn? To hie to a house that does not holler, to ring bells else time, better presently to cater to no more possibilities, to get away. Perhaps the money can be posted. Perhaps they too may choose another slum, some serious, sooty, half-unhappy home where loathed love likelier may be invested. Keeping their scented bodies in the center of the hall as they walk down the hysterical hall, they allow their lovely skirts to graze no wall, are off at what they manage of a canter, and resuming all the clues of what they were, try to avoid inhaling the laden air. Again, I just like to think about the shifts in narrative perspective across the poem as well, right? So there's something, obviously, there's never mere sarcasm, I think, as Larry's comment goes too, right? And there's something even more, I think, complex than double consciousness. And it has everything to do with the craft of the poem, the way she's manipulating perspective, right? So it's not sort of reactionary, it's not sort of intuitive, simply intuitive. I'll stop there. Thank you.
The minute they said select a poem you liked, I thought about the Bronzeville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, But I said to someone, I'm not a scholar. You're going to have all of these really brilliant scholars who are going to be talking about these poems in a way that I don't usually talk about them. But they said, oh, just talk about why you like the poem, how you picked the poem, and a few things you'd like to say about the poem. I picked this poem because of the emotions in it. One of the things that amazes me is that at my age, I've taught this poem to young people who don't know any of the history or who these people are. So one of the things I do is just give out the poem and say, read this and come back and we'll work on it. And they'll read it and not know who the women are, not know why it's in Mississippi, and then say, okay, we're going to read it again and read it with the history. And they're all sort of amazed that they didn't get it the first time. They did get, though, the emotion that the white mother was carrying around. And I said to them, what about that last little quatrain, the black mother? And they had no way to make a connection. So what I wanted to do is just to read the poem, stop along the way, and kind of pick up a couple of things that go on in the poem. From the first, it had been like a ballad. It had the beat inevitable, it had the blood, a wildness cut up and tied in little bunches, like the four-line stanzas of the ballads she had never quite understood. The ballads they had set her to in school. Herself, the milk-white maid, the maid mild of the ballad, pursued by the dark villain, rescued by the fine prince, the happiness ever after that was worth anything. It was good to be a mild maid. That made the breath go fast. Her bacon burned. Right away, what she's done is she's laid out the poem, the backbone of the poem, the belief that the woman who burns the bacon, the belief that she's sort of living by. What we're going to see by the end of the poem, not only the bacon burns, but our damn world burns down. It's a horrifying picture of her coming apart. Like she said, something is silenced. Gwendolyn Brooks calls it. This is one of the new things, one of the things that's silenced. Her bacon burned. She hastened to hide it in step-on can and drew more strips from the meat case. The eggs and sour milk biscuits did well. She set out a jar of her new quince preserve. There's a pause. But and she goes on, she's going to go back and forth like this. But there was something about the matter of the dark villain. He should have been older, perhaps. The hacking down of a villain was more fun to think about when his menace possessed undisputed breadth, undisputed height, and a harsh kind of vice. The best of all, when the history was cluttered with the bones of the many eaten knights and princesses. The fun was disturbed then all but nullified, when the dark villain was a blackish child of 14, with eyes still too young to be dirty, and a mouth too young to have lost every reminder of its infant softness. That boy must have been surprised, for these were grown-ups. Grown-ups were supposed to be wise, and the fine prince, and that other so tall, so broad, so grown. Perhaps the boy had never guessed that. The trouble with grown-ups was that under the magnificent shell of adulthood, just under, waited the baby full of tantrums. It occurred to her that there may have been something ridiculous in the picture of the fine prince, rushing, rich with the breadth and height and mature solidness whose lack in the dark villain was impressing her, confronting her more and more as this first day after the trial and acquittal wore on, rushing with his heavy companion to hack down on horse that little foe. So much had happened, she could not remember now what the foe had done against her, or if anything had been done. The one thing in the world that she did know with terrifying clarity was that her composition had disintegrated. That, although the pattern prevailed, the breaks were everywhere, that she could think of no thread capable of necessary sew work. Right there you have that second level of the poem that's going. There was the first part of the poem that sort of explained what the background of this dream was, this fantasy that she found herself living. And then you begin to get the picture of the real world she's living in. And by this point in the poem, Brooks says, and she says, she doesn't show yet, she says that the woman's world, that her composition had disintegrated, she's the way she puts it, but that her world had sort of fallen apart and that there's no way to actually sew it back together. At this point, if you know the two stories, at this point, you think about the Chicago mother who has no way to sew it back together. Or another way of thinking of it is, it has been sewn back together. It's her son. She made the baby sit in their places at the table. Then, before calling him, she hurried to the mirror with her comb and lipstick. It was necessary to be more beautiful than ever, the beautiful wife. For sometimes she fancied that he looked at her as though measuring her, as if he considered, had she been worth it? Had she been worth the blood, the cramped cries, the little stuttering bravado, the gradual dulling of those Negro eyes, the sudden overwhelming little boyness in that barn? Whatever she might feel or half feel, the lipstick necessity was something apart. He must never conclude that she had not been worth it. He sat down, the fine prince, and began buttering a biscuit. He looked at his hands, twisted in his chair, scratched his nose. He glanced again, almost secretly, at his hands. More papers were in from the north, he mumbled. More meddling headlines with their pepper words, bestiality and barbarism and shocking. The half sneers that he had mastered for the trial worked across his sweet and pretty face. What he'd like to do, he explained, was kill them all. The time lost, the unwanted fame. Still, it had been fun to show these intruders a thing or two, to show that snappy-eyed mother, that sassy northern brown black. Nothing could stop Mississippi. He knew that. Big fella knew that. And that was so good, or what was so good, Mississippi knew that. Nothing and nothing could stop Mississippi. They could send their petitions and scar their newspapers with bleeding headlines. Their governors could appeal to Washington. What I want, the older baby said, is molasses on my jam. Whereupon the younger baby picked up the molasses pitcher and threw the molasses in his brother's face. I'm going to stop here for a minute. You begin to see not only is her world gone to pieces, but she begins to see that her children's world is possibly going to pieces. What you have here is the violence that the man has been acquitted of. It's the same kind of violence that's going on at that breakfast table. In the next passage, she suddenly sees that. She suddenly sees the capacity of the fine prince to actually destroy his own children. Finally sees that, begins to worry about whether or not she as a mother is able to do that protecting. Whereupon the younger baby picked up the molasses pitcher and threw the molasses in his brother's face. Instantly the fine prince leaned across the table and slapped the small and smiling criminal. At this point, her family is a bunch of criminals, even the children. She did not speak. When a hand came down in a way and she could look at her children, at her child, at her baby child, she could only think of blood. Surely her baby's cheek had disappeared, and in its place surely hung a heaviness, a lengthening red, a red that had no end. She shook her head. It was not true, of course. It was not true at all. The child's face was, as always, the color of the paste in her paste jar. She left the table to the tune of the children's lamentation, which were shriller than ever. She looked out the window. She said not a word. That was one of the new somethings, the fear, tying her as with iron. Suddenly she felt his hands on her. He had followed her to the window. The children were whimpering now, small bits of tots, and she, their mother, could not protect them. She looked at her shoulders. still gripped in the claim of his hands. She tried, but could not resist the idea that a red ooze was seeping, spreading, darkly, thickly, slowly over her white shoulders, her own shoulders, and over all of Earth and Mars. He was whispering something to her, the divine prince, something about love and night and intention. She heard no hoofbeat of the horse and saw no flash of the shining steel. He pulled her face around to meet his, and there it was, close, close, for the first time in all those days and nights. His mouth, wet and red, so very, very, very red, closed over hers. Then a sickness heaved within her. The courtroom Coca-Cola, the courtroom beer and hate and sweat and drone pushed like a wall against her. She wanted to hear it. She wanted to bear it. But his mouth could not go away, and neither would the decapitated exclamation point in that other woman's eyes. She did not scream. She stood there. But a hatred for him burst into glorious flower, and its perfume collapsed them, bigger than all magnolias. The last bleak news of the ballad, the rest of the rugged music, the last quatrain of the ballad of Emmett Till after the murder, after the burial. Emmett's mother is a pretty-faced thing, the tint of a puff of pulled taffy. She sits in a red room, drinking black coffee. She kisses her killed boy, and she is sorry. Chaos in windy grays through a red prairie. One of the things that got me was the movement back and forth into what is her fantasy and the collapse of her fantasy. And what you have here also is a collapse of a whole part of the nation, collapse of their fantasy. So you get within this poem all of the music and all of the tensions of poetry, but you also get here an unsettledness, an unbelievable unsettledness about which mother is this poem really about. Emmett's mother is a pretty-faced thing, the tint of pulled taffy. She sits in a red room, drinking black coffee. She kisses her killed boy, and she is sorry. Chaos in windy grays through a red prairie. Thank you.
Very honored to be here, and I want to thank the organizers and thank my fellow panelists. And I'm just going to try to not mess up. So I've been a bit overly ambitious in this, in that I sort of want to try to talk about two poems, but before I get there, I want to try and talk about sort of the larger project. So the subject of this panel broadly is canonization and publication. So I want to start with Miss Brooks' own words on the subject. So I found this letter in the archive at the University of Illinois down in Urbana, and it was written in 1992 to anthologists at Norton. And I think it's interesting and perhaps a useful moment of Miss Brooks' life to consider, right? By this point, she is at least like reasonably clear about her stature in the canon of 20th century American literature. And so we see her in this moment offer useful thoughts about the preservation and celebration of her own work. Dear Susan Brecka and Norton et al., I'm giving the Norton Anthologies permission to include my poetry without fee. Your company has been loyal to this poetry. Glad you like it for many years, and I am proud of continued inclusion. But aren't you tired of including, for the most part, such elderly poems? I have new work that shows some progress, some change. The long poem Winnie is such a work, and the new little book Children Coming Home has been saluted enthusiastically by some of the most acclaimed writers. Think about this. Consider substituting, for example, Religion, Uncle Seagram, 19 Cows and a Slow Line Walking, The Kura Flower, I Am a Black, or the Near Johannesburg Boy, The Life of Lincoln West, Winnie, etc., For such oldies as A Song in the Front Yard, The White Troops Had Their Orders, The Bean Eaters, all from 1945. She talks about the tendency of folks to only use that last quatrain, right, in the Emmett Till piece. She calls that poem sort of a mere footnote to what precedes it, right? And in the letter, she like repeats "why" in all caps 3 times. So she was like not playing. So she says, "Sometimes I fear these anthologies prefer me presented as a minor detailist, principally interested in beans and daisies and summer's eves, when all you have to do is really sift through," she lists like her more recent works, "to realize that my interest is not only in yesterday, but also in today and tomorrow, in every aspect," and that's all caps, "of today and tomorrow." That's just like an interesting thing to sort of frame, right? Because I think that if we're going to think about sort of how the canon of a writer gets built, I think that in some way it's helpful to look at how they hope to build their own canon. For my purposes, I want to split her writing career into like 4 major categories, which is like too simple, but I'll rock. The first category being like the early life, so everything up to the first book. Second category being like the Norton years, right? So 45 to like 68. Third category being, we'll say 69 to about 1981 when she's publishing with Broadside and Third World primarily. And then the fourth category being when she sort of takes on the project of her own publication, right? A few observations I want to note about like splitting things up in such a way, right? You notice most scholars, and sort of I think the critical eye that gets put on Miss Brooks' work tends to consider almost exclusively or primarily that second part, right? So 1945 to 1968. They even tend more so to focus on about the first 15 years, right? I just think that's an interesting thing to note. And she's frustrated by this, right? She rejects the essentialization of being a minor detailist and instead positions herself as a poet whose vision extends to every aspect of today and tomorrow. And then the third piece, which I think is important, which we can sort of talk about more, but is that I think it's important to consider the material benefits of what it means to publish with a mainstream white press versus an independent black press or a self-run press. Often the earlier poems have larger and longer print runs and remain more available than the other works, right? So I think in some ways the critical eye has been shaped straight up just by like politic and economics, right? And it doesn't actually have to do with the quality of work, but it's a question of resources, right? With that, I sort of want to consider these 2 poems. The Blackstone Rangers. 1, as seen by disciplines. There they are, 30 at the corner, black, raw, ready, sores in the city that do not want to heal. 2, the leaders. Jeff, Gene, Geronimo, and Bop. They cancel, cure, and curry. Hardly the dupes of the downtown thing, the cold bonbon, the rhinestone thing, and hardly in a hurry. Hardly Belafonte, King, Black Jesus, Stokely, Malcolm X, or Rap, bungled trophies. Their country is a nation on no map. Jeff, Gene, Geronimo, and Bop, in the passionate noon, in bewitching night, are the detailed men, the copious men. They curry, cure, they canceled images whose concerts are not divine, vivacious. The different tens are intense, last entries, pagan arguments, translations of the night. The Blackstone bitter bureaus, bureaucracy is footloose. Edit, fuse, fashionable damnations and dissent, and exulting monstrous hand on monstrous hand. Construct, strangely, a monstrous pearl or grace. 3, gang girls, a rangerette. Gang girls are sweet exotics. Mary Ann uses the nutrients of her Orient, but sometimes sighs for cities of blue and jewel beyond her ranger rim of Cottage Grove. Bowery boys, disciples, whipbirds will dissolve no margins, stop no savory sanctities. Mary is a rose in a whiskey glass. Mary's Februaries shudder and are gone. April's fret Frankly, lilac hurries on. Summer is a hard, irregular ridge. October looks away, and that's the year. Save for her bugle love. Save for the bleat of not obese devotion. Save for somebody terribly dying under the philanthropy of robins. Save for her ranger bringing an amount of rainbow in a string-drawn bag. Where did you get the diamond? Do not ask, but swallow straight the spirals of his flask and assist him at your zipper, pet his lips and help him clutch you. Love's another departure. Will there be any arrivals, confirmations? Will there be gleaning? Mary, the shake dancer's child, from the rooming flat, pants carefully, peers at her laboring lover. Mary, Mary Ann, settle for sandwiches, settle for stocking caps, for sudden blood, aborted carnival, the props and niceties of non-loneliness, the rhymes of leaning. I have sort of a few points that I want to bring up in thinking about that work, right? Again, it's important to note sort of Miss Brooks' own intention, right? At least somewhat. So she asked her editor to not let anyone reprint any part of that poem without reprinting the entire 3-part poem. And I think that this is important. She says this, she says, people who select the first tiny part only are interested, I believe, in suggesting to an eager, waiting public that the Rangers are sore and nothing else. A fallacy I went to some pains to discredit. So I think that that is like a really important point, and a really important point to think about across the work of Miss Brooks is the way in which she insists on telling a full story and carries that insistence into her, even the documentation of her own work when it is documented, right? Another point that I think is really interesting and important is the decision to end this poem in 3 parts with the Rangerettes, right? To end it with women sort of squarely in the center in the purview, right? I think that that feels very important as a gesture of importance, particularly in this space that we code as deeply masculine, right? The space of street gangs, et cetera, right? The way that the parts sort of gesture forth, I think that they really build and show the empathetic eye, right? Which is the thing that I admire the most about Miss Brooks' work is that gesture towards empathy always, right? And the full consideration of everyone on their own terms, right? And not on the terms that we would have them, we would place upon them. I want to talk a little bit about the Near Johannesburg Boy. Maybe I'll read a piece of it and then just have like a few notes on it. My way is from woe to wonder. A black boy near Johannesburg, hot in the hot time. Those people do not like black among the colors. They do not like our calling our country ours. They say our country is not ours. I won't read the entire piece, but there's a few things in that piece that I do want to highlight, right? I think that the use of ours, right, and that sort of repeated use, I mean, first off, is like sonically a delight, but I think beyond that, continues to gesture and shows this gesture that I would argue she's always doing, but certainly becomes more pronounced in those later periods. This gesture towards a black world, right? To a kind of like black globalism. And so later in the poem, if you read on, we see the reveal of the boy's family, right? We see the father, we see the mother, and I think that this again is an important positioning of this boy, not simply as a kind of character amorphous just in the world, but someone positioned within a family structure, within a structure, right? So I can't help but read this and think of the uprisings in Soweto in '76, right? You know, the Moynihan Report, right? So at this point we have these sort of two things that in an odd way work in concert, right? We have this sort of pathologizing of dysfunctional or non-existent black family structures. And then we also have this particular image of struggle, particularly in the South African context, that is wholly centered around children, right? That is centered around children almost without the presence of adults, right? So I think that this poem does an important work to reintroduce that family structure and to sort of assert a full humanity. Because I think that these two poems are in conversation, and I think that they, for me, show one of the things that Ms. Brooks is always looking towards, right? I think she's always looking towards the young and towards youth, right, in a particular way, right? And I think that she looks towards young or youthful characters to craft a vision of what she would call today and tomorrow, right? Throughout her work, she seems to understand an adage that I know through like the Jewish faith, which is the adage that each generation reveals new freedoms. So this understanding shapes her writing and her work as a literary citizen, and in my mind makes her unparalleled in her ability to marry those two related yet often competing callings of what it means to sort of be a citizen in literature out in the world and also be a writer, right? She's able to hold both, I think, in a really enviable and a rare way. Yeah, I just want to sort of end with a quote of hers that I quite like. My aim in the next future is to write poems that will somehow successfully call all Black people in taverns, Black people in alleys, Black people in gutters, schools, offices, factories, prisons, the consulate. I wish to reach Black people in pulpits, Black people in mines, on farms, on thrones, not always to teach. I shall wish often to entertain, to illumine. Cool, thank you.